In the text that Matthew read just a few moments ago, 1 Peter, the second chapter, you'll notice that in verse 18, he begins to talk to servants and give them instruction in how they are to treat their masters. In many ways, this is a really difficult section for us to understand because, as far as I know, most of us have not been in that servant-master relationship. Sometimes we'll say, well, it's like the employer-employee relationship, but that's still not exactly the same as a servant-master. And sometimes some children might say it feels like they're in a servant-master relationship, and insert your father joke in there if you want to, but that's really not the same. But did you notice the instruction that he gives to the servants? He tells them to be subject to their masters with all respect. From our history, even in the United States, we know that many of those who were masters were nasty people. Harsh and abusive, unkind, didn't even consider those who were their slaves to be human, almost. He's subject to them, he says, with all respect. And then he emphasizes, because I'm sure it was the same in Paul's day, he says, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. If you're a servant to an unjust master, Peter says, be subject with all respect. And then he tells us why. This, he says in verse 19, this is a gracious thing. This is a favorable thing. This is approved by God. When you are mindful of God, and that's the phrase that caught my attention this week when I was looking at it. Mindful of God. This is a gracious thing when you are mindful of God, that you endure sorrows while suffering unjustly. And he gives us part of the key. The servant who is treating his master who is unjust, being subject to them and respectful of them, has to do it being mindful not of the master, but of God. Mindful of God. I'm thinking about the fact that God is my God. Not just in the sense that, well, God's there and I'll get in trouble if I don't do this. But I think mindful of the fact that he's my father and he's made promises to me, that he's going to take care of me, that I've entrusted my soul to him. So it's not just mindful of God, I think, in the sense of, well, I'm in trouble if I don't. But it's, my God is going to take care of me. And he gives us the example then of Jesus, who suffered also, it says, for us. He suffered unjustly for us. And verse 24, it says, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you've been healed. And that is part of the key for us. Even servants who were Christians were to live to righteousness. That was their focus. I want to be righteous. And that's really what we've been studying in the Sermon on the Mount. I want you to go back with me to Matthew, the 5th chapter. Matthew chapter 5. We've been studying the 5th chapter of Matthew, which is the first portion of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount that deals with helping us to understand what true righteousness is about. And he had told the people, he was telling the people that for them to be truly righteous, he says in verse 20, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And then he gives us 5 examples of what that means to be truly righteous. I want to just pick one of those, but this is how we've been explaining it for those of you who haven't been here. It's an important part of the next part that we're studying. One of the things that he tells us is, according to the old law, you shall not commit adultery. That speaks to my actions, right? That I am to avoid committing adultery. But behind that, he reminds us it's not just about adultery. Jesus reminds us that if I look at a woman with lust, that's committing adultery in my heart. And I made the leap from there to the next point, which is what he's teaching us is that God is faithful. And because God is faithful, that's the kind of character we should have. So ultimately, God is not just saying, well, don't do this. He's saying, don't do this because I'm faithful. I want you to be a faithful people. So a lot of those 5 examples that we looked at revolve around negative prohibitions. That's redundant. Prohibitions that are in the law. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't take oaths, vengeance, or hating your enemies, which was not really in the law, but he was dealing with that. And Jesus helps us to see that these are not just capricious commands from an angry God. That there's a reason that they are there. They're to help us to understand that we are to live according to the essential nature of our Father. I want to be like him, and because I'm like him, I have this character. So true righteousness, as he's telling us, springs from having first this character of God. And because of that, correct thinking and therefore correct practice. So, because God is faithful, I need to be, that's the character, I need to be faithful. And I think in terms of faithfulness. And because I think in terms of faithfulness, therefore, when it comes to my relationship with my spouse, I am faithful to her. It's pretty simple, right? When we look at it that way. Now, in the 5th chapter, verse 16 of the same passage, he says, concerning how we are to live with respect to this world. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So, we are to live in such a way that our light shines in the world, and people see it. I shine before others, and they can see my good works. So clearly, we're not just talking about a righteousness that lives up in a tower and is holy and just in a hermitage or something. And I just say, well, I'm special. Righteousness is about others seeing us being the right kind of people. And that catches us up to the first verse of chapter 6, where he says, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. So now he says, beware that you don't do your righteousness before people in order to be seen by them. For a lot of us, that ends up sounding like a contradiction, doesn't it? That we have these, like 2 possibilities. And always we have to have this question that we ask ourselves, why am I practicing my righteousness? Am I motivated by glorifying my Father in heaven and getting others to glorify him? Or am I motivated by wanting other people to see me and glorify me or approve of me? No, most of us are never going to say it that way. I don't think the scribes and the Pharisees, when they were thinking about what the things they were doing, they were saying, well, I want everyone to think I'm great. But over and over, as we read the stories that Jesus tells us about how the scribes and the Pharisees acted, it's clear that that was their motivation. They wanted that approval. So, ask yourself, why am I practicing my righteousness? To answer that question, we have to look beneath the surface. I have to test myself. I have to really think deeply about why these things are happening. Because so much of what we do, we just do out of habit. Is my righteousness for my Father? Am I helping others to glorify him? Or is it for myself? Why would I want people to glorify me, admire me? There's a lot of reasons that we do these things. Sometimes we do our righteousness for ourselves because I feel like if I keep the law, then God has to approve of me. It's required, it's necessary, so I'm doing it because I have to, and other people will see that. But in a lot of ways, that's still righteousness for myself. Sometimes we do it to fit in our society, within the community that we're in, whatever group we're in, we do it to fit in with that group. That's what I see with the scribes and the Pharisees. They had defined, a certain way of acting and living, and they lived within that community, and they were constantly patting each other on the back about their righteousness. Sometimes I do it just to feel good about myself. Sometimes it's basically my own righteousness. Again, the scribes and the Pharisees, that self-exaltation, look what a good person I am. But for some people, I think of Jesus when, you remember he had crossed the lake on the boat, and the people that he'd been healing walked around the lake and met him there. And it says that when he got off the boat, he saw that the people were harassed and helpless. They didn't understand true righteousness because the scribes and the Pharisees were making it so hard to be righteous that they couldn't attain it. And so they were harassed and helpless instead of being helped. Is my light shining for me? Or is my light shining for my Father in heaven? We have to ask that question. So we're going to talk about 3 important parts of this delicate nature of practicing righteousness, this dichotomy that we have of doing it to be seen but not to be seen. And we need to understand that, first of all, practicing righteousness is always a matter of balance, or poise. There's a right way to think about these things. So while we have this incredible paradox, or contradiction, if that's what you want to say, of doing it to be seen but not seen, we need to understand it's only a superficial contradiction. Because really what Jesus is saying in this passage is that we have to do both of these at the same time. They're not contradictory statements, they're complementary. They're helping us to understand that my life is to be lived so that the world sees me as a shining light. Not only what I do, but I should live in such a way that they know why I do it. Not just the what, but the why. And by understanding our lives and by seeing that they glorify God. I have to live in that way. But in doing so, I still also have to remember that I'm never to draw attention to myself and to try to promote myself. I have to do what's right because it's right, not so that others will see me as being right or special. Sometimes that's hard. Sometimes that even what trips us up is kind of that false humility, which is really rooted in pride, which is, no, I really didn't do anything. There's still a recognition of ourselves. So we have to understand that as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus Christ, who's trying to practice true righteousness, there's this incredible balance that keeps me from going off to the left or the right in practicing that righteousness. And the fact that the passage that Jesus begins with, at least in my translation, the very first word is beware. It's a slippery thing. It's so easy for us to slip in this area where we don't maintain this balance. I wonder if that's because many of us are insecure with our relationship with God and insecure in our relationship with our brother. There's a part of us that desires that they appreciate us and that they appreciate what we do. All I need is a little thank you. A statement even so simple as that can be rooted to some extent in, I want people's approval. I'm really doing it for myself and not for God. And that's dangerous. Another part of that balance that I've seen in some is that we actually stop practicing our righteousness because we might be seen. Some people have taken this passage all the other way and said, I'm not going to do some things because people might notice me. And that's just as dangerous, isn't it? When we swing to that other end, the focus is still wrong in that case. Because I'm still concerned about what others will see or not see. And so I go to extreme lengths to avoid being seen, but in doing that, my light doesn't shine in the world. Careful balance is required for us to do this. Second point, we must be very deliberate. We have to deliberately choose to please God and not ourselves. It's not going to happen by accident. Why do we do things? To be seen by others. Almost always, I want people's approval. I want those people to approve of me, but even behind approving of me is I'm pleasing myself. I want people to approve of me, think well of me, to admire me. I want you to think I'm a great guy. And it's easy to become addicted to that euphoria of appreciation. Righteous acts that appear selfless can be subtly a form of selfishness if we're not careful. And so we have to follow this deliberateness in choosing to serve God. Everything that we do in service to God or in service to man, all of our acts of righteousness have to be evaluated. And this is personally where sometimes we're not good. It's so easy to do things out of habit. I go to church on Sunday mornings. I go to church. I do this for people. And sometimes instead of evaluating why am I doing it, we're just doing it because it's habit, it's routine. So I always have to look and say, are my motives pure? What is the reason that I'm doing these things? Because it's not just about the action, which is very important to understand. We have to practice our righteousness. But it's about what am I thinking? And who am I? That is so important. The third point I want to make is about having the proper perspective. And much of this focuses on the perspective of understanding the presence of God in my life at all times and in all ways. I must never forget that I am a child of God, striving to be like Him. So I must always desire to please my Father. Not just occasionally or in specific situations, but always and in everything. That's where the passage about the slave becomes so important. Going back to 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter, you remember he said, submit to your masters, being respectful to them, being what? Mindful of God. That's what we need to do. Always mindful of God. That God is with me, that God is there. But that's hard, isn't it? I know it's hard because when I was younger, my dad would say, I want you to go out and I want you to chop all the weeds in this section of the yard. Yes, sir. And I would go out there and I would chop weeds for a little bit, but it was hot. And I was a kid, so I was distracted by ants and dirt. And by the end of the day, my dad would come home and say, I thought I told you to chop those weeds. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't. But if my dad stayed there, if he was working around that same area, for some reason I was more focused. And I could get those weeds chopped without the distraction. Do we have the same situation sometimes with our bosses at work? That if our boss is watching us at work, we're just a little bit more diligent. We're not tempted to turn on solitaire on the computer. That just doesn't happen because the boss is right there. In both those examples, that's based in fear. And I don't want you to get the idea that I'm saying we should fear God necessarily, just do these things because we fear Him. I'm just saying we need to have that awareness God is always with me. And that's a good thing. That's a wonderful thing, that he's always with me. Be mindful of God. And so my desire, I want to please my Father, my Heavenly Father, always, knowing that he's right there with me. Jesus provides a great example of this. Jesus lived entirely for God in his life. If you look in John the 12th chapter, verse 49, he says, "For I have not spoken on my own authority, but the Father who sent me has given me a command, what to say and what to speak." Jesus says, my own words, they're not mine. They come from him. It's all about him. In John the 5th chapter, verse 19, the works of God are what Jesus did. Jesus told the people at that time, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise." I love that passage. Because I see what my Father is doing, that's what I'm doing. And that's exactly what he's teaching us in the Sermon on the Mount. Because of who my Father is, this is who I'm going to be. And this is what I'm going to do. In John the 8th chapter, he speaks of the honor that he gives the Father. He says, "Yet I do not seek my own glory." And that's where so many of us struggle in very subtle ways. I do not seek my own glory. There's one who seeks it, and he's the judge. The only glory I want to receive is not from men, it's from God. I honor him. Jesus says he'll honor me. Great example for us, isn't it? So because God is always there, I live entirely for him. And I know that he knows me. In Luke the 16th chapter, verse 15, some men had come to Jesus and were testing him once again. And he said to those men, "You are those who try to justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts." And that's much of our struggle with righteousness. We try to justify ourselves before men. God knows the heart. On Wednesday night, we were studying the 139th Psalm of David. And David in that passage gives us a beautiful picture of that attitude. David says in Psalm 139, verse 2, "You discern my thoughts from afar." God doesn't just see what we're doing, he discerns our thoughts. In verse 4 of that 139th Psalm, David says, "Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Jehovah, you know it all together." Some of us hear that and it sounds kind of freaky, kind of scary. God knows what I'm thinking. He knows what I'm going to say before I say it. David saw it as a good thing. He sees me wherever I am. He sees my actions. He knows my thoughts. He knows my heart. We need that perspective when it comes to righteousness. That's the perspective we need for each day of my life. I can't hide anything from him. And I don't want to hide anything from him. He's there. I can't try to live my life in a way that deceives him. So maybe it would help me every morning if I woke up to remind myself of this. God sees me. He knows what I'm doing. Nobody else may know. In fact, nobody else knows at all what I'm thinking, but he does. I need to remind myself of this each moment, that I am in the presence of my Father. And think of how that would change things. There would be no hypocrisy in my life, probably. There would be no vanity. There would be no self-glory as I try to follow after him. Do you notice also in this passage, this is an important part of the perspective that he gives. He says in Matthew 6, verse 1, "For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven." If you're doing your righteousness to be seen by men, then you'll have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. He repeats that throughout. If you're doing it to be seen of men, you've received your reward. If you're doing it before God, then your Father who sees it in secret will reward you. So we have this question. What reward would you rather receive? Would you rather have the very ephemeral applause of men, which is so fickle? Or would you rather have the approval of God, the reward from your Father? James said, for every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there's no variation or change. Every good gift comes from God. He's going to give you the reward that you should seek. We have to keep that perspective in mind. Men, that's going to change. And it's not going to last. But with God, you get true rewards. Now, just like in the previous section, Jesus gave 5 examples of what it means to have true righteousness. He's going to give us in this section that follows 3 examples of what it means to practice your righteousness the right way. He's going to talk about giving, about fasting, and about prayer. I got those out of order, but nonetheless, those are the 3 examples. He's going to show us what it means. I love how in what Jesus has done is he's taken us away from just the negative and said, these are the things that we do, that I do for God, that I do for other people. And what he's going to help us see, again, is that true righteousness springs from our character, a character which needs to be like God's. That I'm thinking about glorifying God, and therefore I'm doing his righteousness and not my own. So I hope that you'll join us next week if you can, as we continue that study. And next week, we'll be talking about the practice of giving. I appreciate your attention this morning. We'd love to help you this morning if you're not a child of God. If you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and you're ready to, because you believe in him, you want to be baptized, have your sins washed away, let us help you with that as we stand and sing.
Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing blood? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?